As I mentioned briefly in my assessment, this is not the first time I've tackled a game that is quote-unquote controversial. What I actually mean by that, though, is not what you're probably thinking. There's several games in the industry, and I've looked at several of them myself, where a portion of the people, we'll call them Group A, looked at this and say, this is a terrible game. And whether their grievances are legitimate or not doesn't necessarily matter, but let's go ahead and say their grievances are legitimate, so they just hate the game. Then people B, who just heard over and over and over about how this game was terrible, played the game and ended up liking it, especially because they were kind of trying to be contrary-wise to the people who are like, oh my god, it's a terrible game. So then we've got Group P. And then we've got Group C, which is people who played the game and didn't, hate it, but they felt like people were bashing it a little bit too much, so they ended up praising it more than they actually would, even though they didn't actually like it that much. And then there's Group D, who liked it a little bit, but didn't like it that much, but were trying to praise it more, and ended up bashing it more because of Group B, and you see where this goes. This is something normal that happens a lot across all manner of medium, across all manner of entertainment. This is not unique or new to video games. So I'm just going to say this right off the front here. Yes, I liked Assassin's Creed 3. Yes, I would put it as a net positive. The end, basically. And that's the rumination. See you guys! No, actually, I have way too much stuff to talk about, and I apologize if I get boring this one, but most of this stuff to talk about is kind of variable. So I'm going to go ahead and try and cover the things I didn't like about it first. And Lord knows, I've got a couple points on that. First and foremost, and this was literally the first thing that came to my mind, the facial models really were weird this time around. Not so much bad in the past. Most of the stuff in the past I was with a few exceptions, but for the most part, good facial models, standard, no actual problems. But when I first saw Desmond and William and Rebecca and Sean, I was just like, huh? And I know their faces changed a little bit, but that's not the problem. The problem is their faces just look terrible. And their facial animation looks kind of bad too. You can tell they basically threw them together, and it's kind of understandable why. I mean, they get very little screen time, relatively speaking, to, all the things in the past. So, not as high of a priority. Still bugged the crap out of me. I have to point out a quote here. I'm kind of building up to a point here, believe it or not. And I quote, "Naturally, you dropped me in the Animus." In other words, what happens, for those of you who are not familiar, this is not a spoiler, this is literally the first event that happens, so don't give me that. First thing that happens, you walk up and you're like, oh my god, ancient thing, pass out. And then you're in the Animus. Because of course you are. And again, he says, and naturally you dropped me in the Animus rather than, try to see if I was okay or whatever. I mention this because it's the game kind of making fun of itself, so it does get some points. But as has been pointed out, the series tends to lean on the Animus as a plot device a little more than it should. I mean, the joke has been made, oh my god, I forgot where I put the milk. I must relive the ancient memories of my ancestors in order to learn where the milk would be put, something like that. I believe that was Yahtzee who made that joke. I could be wrong. Either way, they do tend to lean on the Animus as a fix-all a little bit too much. Yes, I know that's kind of the point of the series. Like I said, I'm building up to something. One of the things I do actually like is that they added as you're going through the Animus, this is true throughout all of Assassin's Creed 3, you see this strange geometry as it's going through it. I'd call it a pseudo-matrix thing, except it's not really matrixy at all. It's kind of its own thing. That being said, the slow construction and the slow build of it, in my opinion, was something that was being done deliberately because it's indicative of where Desmond's mind is at this point in time. Basically, given all that Desmond's been through, in a very short period of time, don't forget, it has not been long since he was abducted from his do-nothing bartender job, and then thrown into the first Animus, and then thrown into the second Animus to train, and then put into the Animus again in order to, blah, 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 blah. So, in all honesty, he's been through a lot, and I think that this sort of fractured, dematerializing, rematerializing substance was indicative of the way his mind was working at the time. Probably me reading too much into it, but nevertheless, it made sense to me. I have a note here that literally just says Balthier. Points to anybody who gets it. Gideon Emery has a relatively small cameo in this game, which is funny because he's a lot more established in the ancillary works. But I just wanted to mention that really quick. It's always nice to hear him. So So yeah, more negative things, but I think we're actually going to go ahead and just move on to the big negative thing. Which, do I have any more notes on that? Give me just a second here, really quick. Nope. How many people out there think the Assassin's Creed series, especially as of this point in time, should abandon the present plot? Now, I'm not going to raise my hand because I'm really torn on this issue. But it's a thought that's worth thinking about, and the mere fact that it's something that is so debatable, something that there's so much evidence both for and against it, I think kind of makes my point for me. The problem is, in many cases, I mentioned that whole just tossing in the Animus thing. In many cases, it feels like we're just trying to get back to the past, to enjoy the past. Now, in some cases, they do actually tie the past and present storylines in relatively well. Point there. But oftentimes, even within the same game, and this game is guilty of this, it will both make sense in some sections and then just be kind of thrown in other sections to get back to the past, or to try and ham-fistedly tie it back into the present, that kind of a thing, right? Yeah, there's no real getting around it. I do actually think that it would be worth considering just playing the character rather than trying to deal with this present thing, especially without wishing to spoil, with the way that the Assassin's Creed 3 plot has gone in the present. The other reason I think this, though, is something I've brought up before. I have actually postulated that Assassin's Creed feels a little bit more coherent and more self-contiguous if you consider it to effectively be a fantasy science fiction rather than pure science fiction. Granted, even if you look at Assassin's Creed, the series, as a science fiction work, it is incredibly soft science. Like, really, really, really soft science. I mean, Star Trek is looking at Assassin's Creed and going, damn, dude. But that being said, if it had basically embraced the fantasy side of it, and the fantasy science fiction side of it, and just kind of removed the Animus from the equation, imagine just playing through these individuals who are of the bloodline, who, as I mentioned before, are enhanced, are augmented, are stronger, are more durable, are more athletic, more agile. These people who have what are effectively superhuman abilities, even though it's a very small on the scale of like all fiction ever, for a totally ordinary world which just has totally ordinary people, these people are superhuman. And the things they can do are superhuman. And, it actually makes perfect sense that, for example, Kenway would be able to, be superhuman, not because of his training or anything like that, but because of his bloodline, which would also make sense for why Connor, despite a very small amount of training, also can pull off some incredibly, amazing feats, relatively speaking, because of his bloodline. You see where I'm going with this? And just kind of remove the present plot from it entirely. Now, that being said, I do have to also add that the present plot does have its own intrigues and does make me interested in its own way, especially several characters I really enjoy in the present, namely William, Rebecca, and Sean. You'll notice I did not list Desmond there. Yes, I did that on purpose. I cannot find Desmond interesting. They really worked very hard to make Desmond more interesting and flesh him out more of a character in this game especially. And at this point, I just can't bring myself to care. It felt so rushed. It felt like they were just like, quick, care about him. Please. And I'm just sitting here like, no. Just my opinion. All right, more negatives. I don't think I actually wrote down negatives, as weird as that sounds. I could be wrong. That's okay, because I know the negatives. I mentioned a few of them in the assessments. This game is rather buggy. The graphics bugs were pretty common, actually very common. The audio bugs were almost omnipresent. I actually would have to sit down and think about a mission I went through where I did not have some audio bugs, where the audio just wasn't playing right, or would clip, or would do the thing where it starts to play and stops, and it starts to play and it stops. There were a lot of bugs throughout this game, but like I said in the assessment, I only had a few that actually obstructed my ability to play the game. Mainly a little bit of dodgy detection when it came to the climbing puzzles, especially on trees, and the bug where I was chasing an individual and then he just stood there and stared at me, and then I had to restart the mission. I also had one bug on a ship mission similar to that, where I was trying to take out a ship, and I sunk it, And then, like, the red dot never went away, that indicates that this is an enemy. And it was funny because, you see the red dot on the ship and it's sunk, so the red dot just kind of... and I'm swiveling the camera to watch it. It didn't actually go down that far because, there's not that much under the waves, but it just... And then it just sat there and I'm like, okay, I'm not sure what to do about that. Let's talk about the big negatives, and let's talk about why it is I think most people don't like this game. As I mentioned in the assessment, the plot of Assassin's Creed 3 is very weak. The present plot has to do with trying to deal with the disaster. The past plot has to do with the American Revolution. Now, if you're paying attention, you get the problem already. The past plot isn't a plot. That's not a story. That's a series of events that are setting changing, and that can work. But that's not a plot, and so and especially because you're not actually directly attached to the American Revolution. You're just, ancillary to it. You keep getting dragged along with it. Your own particular plot is basically, if you really want to boil down to it, just trying to get the damn key back, which is, not really that compelling if I'm just going to be blunt about it. The other problem with that, though, is whether or not you're going to enjoy this game, even for the parts that I'm going to talk about in a positive manner, is going to depend on your enjoyment of that type of story. A story about politics, a story about themes, a story about nations, a story about philosophy, and a story about history, and history evolving, war. I mean, this is basically a war setting, a war game for all intents and purposes. And if you're not the kind of person who enjoys that, then you're probably going to look at it and be like, and I can't even blame you for that. But let's say you are the kind of person who enjoys that sort of thing, like me, for example. Why would you still have a problem really enjoying this game? Maybe if you made a protagonist... You know what? I'm going to talk about Connor, obviously. I already gave that away. I'm just going to go ahead and summarize my thoughts on Connor. You ready for this? Keep in mind, I'm not kidding. I think Connor would have been a more interesting protagonist if he was a silent protagonist. Now, I know you're looking at me like, oh my god, or maybe you're going to accuse me of racism because you're stupid, but the problem here is the voice actor they picked was really bland. He's not bad, but he really does not know how to get across the nuances that are necessary to flesh out a character like that. So, really did not care for the voice actor. Second point, his lines... Now, again, I'm not going to necessarily blame the voice actor for this because of the second point. His lines are really, really bland. Very tepid, very... I am doing this. Half the time, the reason I mentioned the silent protagonist thing, it came across the first time when he was in a scene and he had like 3 lines and each of them was only a few words long, and they didn't actually add anything to the scene. He was basically just repeating what had just happened. Better than tell the joke here. Or, just stating that he will do it, or I will do this, or whatever. And the whole time it made me think, maybe if he just stayed silent, maybe that would be better. Because each time he opened his mouth, it was like, ugh. And again, I don't know if that's the writing, the voice director, or the voice actor, or some combination of the above, but ugh. It is worth noting there is some good voice acting in this game. I'll talk about that later. But there is also other bad voicing acting in this game other than Connor, and it makes me wonder if this game was either a little bit rushed or a little bit under budget. I'm not sure which. But while we're talking about Connor, let's go ahead and get into the other thing. Connor... I almost feel like this was done on purpose, and Connor himself actually has a line about this when he's still a child, when he's narrating. He basically says that he does not feel like this is, his choice, or that he is taking a stand. He feels obligated. He feels like he has to do this. And the way he phrases it, that's probably the only thing where the voice actor really gets across some subtlety. The way he phrases it really gets across the point. He is bitter. He resents having to do this, having to become an assassin, having to fight for his people, having to do all these things. He doesn't like it. But he has to do it because the spirits asked, Juno, in this case. No, that's not a spoiler. Again. We'll get to real spoilers later, trust me. Although that is a spoiler if you haven't played the previous series, but you know the rule. Spoilers are acceptable up to the game I'm talking about now. Speaking of which, no spoilers for Assassin's Creed 4, please. I haven't even played it yet. So. I know it has pirates. That's about all I know. And Heath Ledger. But... yeah, the whole through the game, I could see them actually deliberately making him out as and I'm sorry, there's no better way to put this, a petulant child. On purpose, though, is my point. I mean, he does come across as a petulant child. He comes across as a brat, if I'm just being blunt. He comes across as ungrateful, foolish, headstrong, all these kind of things that are generally negative character traits, and I feel like they did that on purpose, again, to emphasize that whole point, and to get to a point I'll be talking much later when we get to themes. But even if you're doing that on purpose, that doesn't make it less irritating. I've talked about this many, many times. When you are deliberately irritating, you're still irritating. And so I just wanted to club Connor over the head so many times. And it's a shame because I really liked a lot of the characters around Connor, like Achilles, or Haytham, or Lee even, or Sam Adams was alright, etc., etc., you get the point. Now, there is one other negative to really talk about before I move on, and that is the fact that this game is very depressing. I actually had some issues going through this one because I just finished The Witcher and Witcher 2, which are pretty damn, depressing. I want to explain what I mean in this case, though, because the word depressing is actually a very generic term. It can refer to a lot of things. Let me actually explain what I mean this time. Assassin's Creed 3 has an underlying core of effectively futility and hopelessness. The idea that the absolute best you can do, if you really work hard and you really apply yourself and you get lucky, on top of working hard and really applying yourself, things will be bad. And I think that summarizes it very nicely right there. The fact that the best possible outcome is for things to be bad. And that brings up that futility thing. That brings up that just depressing thought in the back of your mind that, well, if you don't, what's the point then? But of course the point is, if you don't work really hard and you don't really apply yourself, you don't really try, you don't really risk your neck over and over and over, and you don't get lucky, then things will be worse. And I think that that's one of the reasons why some people, I know at least 2 people personally, also had a problem with this game. It is a very much of a downer game. I'll be talking about that more later. Sometimes it's done very well, beautifully. I would even say artistically. But the rest of the time, it's just hammering you in the face with how bad things are. With no subtlety, with absolute bluntness. I mean, the epilogue, for God's sakes. But anyways, let's talk about things I did like. Wait, hang on. One more thing I want to talk about that I didn't like. It's actually a note I've got right here. It's called, I Hate Wolves. It's called my sister. Hi.
Hi, guys.
I'll leave that part in.
Bye, guys.
That was my wonderful sister. I guess you probably knew that. I've got a note here that literally just says, I ... hate ... wolves. I really don't know what else to add to that. If you've played this game, you understand what I mean. Bears and cougars also get stuck in that. I'm going to go and explain why I think this is a bad thing, though. Genuinely. With every other animal, you can just fight them. Even in these cases, you can just fight them or take them down or whatever. And this, I do actually like the hunting mechanic. I was going to mention that later, but now's a good time as any. I actually genuinely enjoyed the hunting mechanic in this game. It was fun. It was fun stalking. It was fun hiding. It was fun analyzing the clues. It was fun laying traps. It was fun getting up in the trees and trying to ambush. I actually enjoyed it. It actually reminded me a lot of several of the features I really enjoyed about Metal Gear Solid 3. I've always enjoyed games that embrace that sort of on-site procurement kind of mentality. And Assassin's Creed 3 probably pulls that off better than most games I've played, period. So I really like that. And of course, the fact that you can make a ton of money with hunting is also good, because it means you actually have a reason to hunt other than just fun. So, yeah, and I really like that. But the problem is when you're fighting wolves and cougars and bears, it's all quick time. There's no actual fighting. It's just a random quick... It's pure QTE, in the purest sense of the word. The scene slows down for a second. You see a button. You hit the button. Then you hit the other button. Then you hit the other button. Bears are the longest. You have to do, I believe, 6 or so button presses in a row, and then you win. But if you fail, you die. Like, you actually die. You don't just get hurt. You are killed. And that is the worst kind of QTE, the one that's literally a pass-fail. The one that's just binary, oh, you win, or oh, you lose. And I hate that crap. I mean, it's still not the worst QTE I've ever seen. Resident Evil 4 still has earned that merit with the Krauser knife fight, which I will never forgive that game for. But I hated that. So let's talk about more stuff that I did actually like here. Actually, I want to talk about something. Well, no, we'll go to that. We'll go into that. I do like the history tidbits. I know that's not new. I know that's not new to the series, but I really like the flavor that they put and the effort. The obvious effort was on display in writing Sean, because for those of you who don't know, every now and again you'll see like a famous monument or a famous person or just a location or a ship or a place or whatever, and there will be a little lore tidbit explaining what it is, but it's actually being written in character by Sean, the British gentleman with the wit and the sardonicism. And a great deal of effort was put not only making those informative, but amusing to read. So I actually got into the habit of literally reading every single one of them as I went through. Slowed me down a little bit, but at the same time it was like something I looked forward to. It was like, oh, what's this? Ooh, what's this? Oh, what are you going to tell me about this? That kind of a thing. And it highlighted the level of effort they put into doing their history, doing their homework. That's something that the teams who've been working in the Assassin's Creed series have always done a very good job of. I'll talk about that more a little bit later, hopefully, if I remember, because it's kind of a small point. I guess I'll talk about it now. The point is, one of the things I liked about this, one person I was talking with once derogatorily referred to the Assassin's Creed series as, oh, so it's just real life except with conspiracy theories. Now, in my opinion, that was not only too derogatory, but really missing the strongest point of it. That point being, what they did was it's harder than it sounds to really sit down, look at history as we know it. Now, I always got to put quotes on that because, as we know, history is not exact and not, we don't know exactly what happened. But to look at history as we know it, as it's written, as it's determined, and then to try and attach the story in a way that it makes sense to that history. Many times, this is true throughout the whole series, by the way, especially in Assassin's Creed Revelations, believe it or not, and Assassin's Creed 2 both really did this. Or not Revelation, excuse me, Brotherhood. Brotherhood and Assassin's Creed 2 both really did this really well as well. They would take well-known events and basically throw a spin on them that partially explained why things happened that way, or explain why things were interpreted the way they were interpreted, and then show you what actually happened, actually, throughout the game, that kind of a thing. Very well done. This game is no exception. Lots of instances of showing how blah happened, and from the perspective of someone who was actually there. And yeah, suffice it to say, it was very interesting to see how some events were interpreted. That's all I'm going to say about that. Because if I was just going to be going down the list, I'd basically just be listing most of the major events of the game. That being said, let's go ahead and segue this into a negative. While I get it, and I get why they did this, I feel like the execution was a little bit lacking in the tourism aspect. And to explain what I mean by that, as you're going through this game, and it feels like you're just being carted around on a tour of famous people from the era and famous events of the era. And admittedly, it's another one of those schizophrenic things. Sometimes it's handled very well, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you just kind of stumble in and, hey, they're signing the Declaration of Independence. Or, hey, here's Benjamin Franklin, and he's got it, it's just, sometimes it's like, hey, and it feels like there's just some kind of tour guide who's like, and on your, like from Disneyland, and on your right here, we have the Declaration of Independence. Hang on, I'll scare it off with a flare. That kind of a thing. Other times it was woven in a lot better to the path that Connor was taking. The events where Tom Hickey died is a great example of that. That's not really a spoiler. That's just... I'm really working on this spoiler thing, I swear. But there's only two things I actually consider to be spoilers in this game, so forgive me. Speaking of which, though, let's go ahead and segue into the deathbed scenes. The return of the deathbed scenes, more clearly. I don't know what they're actually called officially. I've been calling them the deathbed scenes for a while now. But I really, really, really like that. And they used it rather clearly and effectively before. It's one of the things I praised most about Revelations, because Altair would have deathbed scenes, and Ezio would not. Or at least he would have the more similar versions. But that made perfect sense, because it was indicative of the mindset of the two people. Now, in this case, they threw them back in, but again, I think that it was a good choice. Not just because it allows us to flesh out these characters much more, which I'll be talking about later in the spoiler section, but it was a wonderful way to demonstrate, probably better than the voice actor ever did, no offense again, or the voice acting, or the character, whatever, Connor's mentality. In fact, there's one line later with regards to one of the characters that you assassinate, where one of the other NPCs present is trying to basically debase him. And Connor says, "No, stop." He's like, "Well, he was a horrible man." Connor says, "Yes, but he was a man." I think that mindset, while it is naive, and while it is somewhat ignorant, as is mentioned throughout the series, or the game, excuse me, it is very indicative of how he approached these people. And so with every single case, he actually wanted to give them the honor of that deathbed scene. He wanted to give them their last moments to talk and to explain and whatnot, even when it wasn't something that he actually, was trying to learn from them. So it made sense that the deathbed scenes would be back for Connor. It'll be interesting to see if they're in 4. Nobody tell me. I want to find out for myself. But, now I want to comment on 2 other things that are very off topic here. First is the fact that when I first started playing, I was having a really hard time playing the game. Like, genuinely. It was as if my keyboard wasn't even plugged in. Those of you who've watched my streams at all may know that I like to do some speedruns, and I've got a nice little USB controller that looks like this. Turns out, it was automatically detecting I had a controller plugged in and making me play with this. So I'm playing Assassin's Creed 3 here. And I actually got a decent ways in until it reached the point where I was literally incapable of advancing, because whatever button it wanted me to hit was not a button that this had, because there aren't that many buttons, and there's no analogs here. So I literally at that point had to be like, okay, let's switch to keyboard control. Just a funny little point I wanted to share there. Another fun little point. I've talked before about the kind of things that the Bastion members do within regards to the Imperium. I know, kind of out of left field, but bear with me. One of the things that's big, that's very important, is for them to learn and integrate themselves into a society. This happens at the highest levels. The actual agents, they walk in and they say, they will actually be born as an individual of that setting, so they can grow and learn and work within the system rather than violating it or altering it or turning into some kind of little, Casper the Genocidal Ghost and forcing an automatic change on the setting, which is completely contrary to the entire purpose of the Bastion. So I just mention it because one of the things that occurred to me this time through, which probably should have occurred to me before, is the whole synchronization thing that they've been doing since Assassin's Creed 1 is actually very similar to that in concept, really. The idea of fully, Assassin's Creed 1, it's actually probably the strongest. You had to go back and actually synchronize yourself through most of Altair's events, during the assassination things, during the rise of the Templars, etc., in order to fully be able to see how things ended. So cool, that makes sense. I just wanted to comment on that. Now that I've been paying attention, I've noticed that sort of thing in fiction a little bit more, because there's a few other things I've seen that in. And it's just an interesting concept because, the idea is that you want to work through within a system rather than breaking it, right? Not really that hard of an idea. Anyways, moving on. Okay. Now, I've just got a bunch of really brief tidbits here. I'm just going to go down the list here, okay? I already mentioned the hunting. One of the things this game had really well was its directing, its actual visual directing. The style of it is extremely well done. I have nothing but praise for it. The way the cutscenes were cut, this is pretty much entirely cutscenes, but the way they were directed, the way they did the transitions, the way that they would move through the action, very artistic, very well done, very excellent. Always got across the point of the scene. It was such good directing that I found myself still praising it sometime after, if you know what I mean. Like, I'm way into the game, and then I'd see a cutscene, and I would just think, wow, it's really well done. So, definite props there. Oh, shoot. I forgot to mention my other big negative about the game. Yeah. Okay. We're going to talk about a big negative, and then we're going to talk about a big positive, and then we're going to go ahead and just turn on the spoiler alert, because, yeah. Big negative first. No music. Now, those of you who, again, have watched my stream for any length of time know that I have a thing called no music. It's, for those of you not aware, it basically means it specifically means a scene is being played where music should be playing, but it isn't. Now, I'm not saying music should be played in every scene, for those of you who haven't heard me talk about this. No music should be a tool. You should use the absence of music as an artistic tool to get across a point. It can be done very well. Final Fantasy VI, train scene, right after Doma. No music. Very well done. Kingdom Hearts 2, done constantly. To bad effect. It just kind of detracts and derails from some scenes when you see them with no music. And there's just no getting around that. That being said, Assassin's Creed 3 has kind of the same problem, except it's actually worse. In fact, I can't actually remember a game I've played where I had this extent of a problem. Fortunately, I was actually warned about this one, but I went ahead and played the game, normally for quite a while, and I found myself just getting irritable, just aggravated, because there were huge chunks of gameplay. Well, there's no music. It's just, ambient sound or the sound effects of whatever's happening. And don't get me wrong, there is music in this game. It's usually for the chase scenes or when you're in combat or whatever, but then it just goes back to being nothing. And given, I mentioned earlier, either in the assessment or in the rumination, how much time I spend running from point A to point B, either on the horse or on myself, or out hunting or whatever, and it's just quiet. And after a while, that just really started to grate on me. So I'm going to give you a recommendation that was given to me that worked for me as well. I actually turned on iTunes in the background, set the music to about half, and just turned on one of my favorite playlists. And that made the game so much more enjoyable. I'm not even kidding. This is not me being facetious. This is not me trying to bash the game. I probably would not have actually finished the game as cleanly or as well as I did if I hadn't had my music playing in the background. It was just really irritating not having it there. That being said, I'd also like to make a point, though. I have said before that virtually every game, especially an MMO, can be enlivened by the presence of Morrowind music. Morrowind music fit Assassin's Creed, especially when you're going through the hills and the frontier areas, very, very well. See for yourself. Yeah, you'll see what I mean. Let's go into that big positive. I wish you could actually read my handwriting, but it's basically, I have the word ship in all caps, and I actually drew a little heart right by it. Let me explain a little bit. I've talked before that I'm basically a ship kind of a guy. It's one of the very few things that's just an automatic yes for me. I've mentioned this before. The idea of having your own ship, the idea of captaining your own ship, the idea of... And it applies basically equally between naval and space. Having my own ship is such a huge thing for me. It has been since I was a kid. It has not gone down since I've grown up. At least I hope I've grown up. So having your own ship, yes, hell yes. Even people I know who absolutely hate this game love the ship sections, and it's hard not to see why. The ship sections are very, very well done, especially given what you're working with. They're obviously very heavily romanticized, but done so in a good way. And even while done so, they make an effort to make it feel like it's not romanticized. It's still video gamey, but it's video gamey in a good way. It's video gamey with flavor to make it feel fleshed out, and it's video gamey so that it does not take away from the enjoyment of actually playing the game at the expense of, whatever, being more artsy or whatnot, or realistic or immersive. And as you're sailing, on the oceans, and the waves are cresting, and the waves actually... It's one of the funny things, because as much as this game is heavily tutorialized, and let's be honest, this game is actually really heavily tutorialized, they never actually once point out the fact that, the waves can actually affect the arcs of your shot and whether or not you can hit an enemy ship. Of course, you could figure that out, but that's my point. There's lots of little details like that, or the fact that you can still actually do damage to larger ships with the swivels. It's just much, much slower, and, and the fact that you can... Well, okay, there is actually a tutorial for ramming a ship, but I didn't know that. I did all the little side missions first, and finding out that you can actually ram a ship and do some serious damage to it was explained to me when a frigate broadsided me and took my health from about this to about this. Full on T-boned, by the way. The music for the ship sections, the sound effects, it was actually very immersive for me, despite my video gaming comment earlier. I felt like I had the wind in my hair. You know what I mean. I felt like it was actually there, and the way that you steer, and the unfurling of the sails and the broadsides, and I cannot possibly praise it enough. My only possible complaint was that there was not more of the ship missions. Now, of course, you're probably with it, it's. I had a comment here, and I don't know how to explain it properly, but basically, with the benefit of hindsight, it becomes obvious because Assassin's Creed 4 is out, and is basically the ship game, except now it's an entire game, and also Pirates, Pirates of the Caribbean, the game, as it's been described. But if I had known about Assassin's Creed 4, the comment I would be making right now is, man, they should make a whole game out of this mechanic. Obviously, some other people agreed with me significantly about that. From what I understand about 4, they actually flesh it out even more and add even more to it, and more stuff you can do, more upgrades to your ship, more variety in the actual combat, and of course, I forget what they're called, but they're like legendary vessels or something, which are very fun and very hard to take down. I'm really looking forward to that. Okay, anything else before I get to the spoilers section? I mean, look at this. I've just filled this page completely because there's just so much I was talking about. I think... Hang on, what's this here? Yeah. What? I think we're going to go ahead and cut it. So hopefully I'll remember to actually put in the sound effect this time. So, spoilers. We're not going to leap right into the big spoilers, though, the big two. We're just going to start talking about the game freely. So let's talk about William Miles, a.k.a. John Delancey is awesome. William Miles is not the most well-written character in the universe, but he is extremely well acted. I'm sorry, it's true. John Delancey is an excellent voice actor. He always has been. And he knows how to really add a degree of nuance to his lines. I've said it before and I've said it again. A really good voice actor can help salvage a bad role, and at the same time, sometimes a good voice actor can't salvage a really bad role. It depends on the circumstances. But in this case, I feel it was the former. I feel that I actually really ended up liking William Miles by the end of this game. And I think the reason why is he is portrayed an interesting character. What we see in William Miles is I know this is going to sound weird, someone who is effectively a completely ordinary human, superhuman abilities notwithstanding, who has been thrust into extraordinary circumstances and is trying to deal with those extraordinary circumstances as best he can, with all the tremendous stress and pressure and the knowledge of consequence that lays upon him as a result of that. He comes across as an everyman who then had to step up and never actually knew how to do that properly, and still doesn't, and is still just trying to do the best that he can. He comes across as very human, and his interactions with Desmond really help highlight that. I ended up liking William a lot in this game. One of my favorite scenes, this is kind of spoiling, you save him from you-know-who, and he's like, I can't believe you did this, I can't believe you did this. You did this whole thing, and you jeopardized the mission just to save your father. And that's the him who's stressed, the him who's trying to live up to the expectation. And Desmond says yes, and then the human William Miles just hugs his son. No words, just hugs him. Very well done. Really helped flesh out the individual, which is... I'm going to be building to the overall... I want to talk about the themes last, because I'm going to be building up to that. Speaking of which, I just want to make a very quick side note. It's kind of funny, the voice actor who did Vidic, Warren Vidic, the villain, actually did a lot of lines, but that's only because he speaks a lot in the one mission you actually see him in. That being said, I have to comment on two things. One, thank God that bastard's finally dead. I've wanted to kill him since Assassin's Creed 1. Spoiler. Point two, it is incredibly ironic that Warren Vidic died in the manner that he himself... He didn't die to an assassin stabbing him with a blade. He died to someone controlling someone else to kill him. He died, kind of literally, to the Templar philosophy, to the Templar way of thinking. And I found that incredibly amusing and ironic, and very appropriate way for him to go down. While we're talking about the present, let's go ahead and talk about the general lack of HUD. Heads-up display in the present. That I thought was a really well done thing, because in the past sections Well, not only you're in the Animus, so the HUD can actually be explained as part of the Animus, fleshing things out, but it actually made the present sections feel more real, which I'll get to more in just a second. And it helped you, it trained you to actually recognize the animations, and rather than just look for the little red triangle or whatever, to actually see when things are going to happen or figure out what you can do where and how, rather than just being like, well, the HUD is telling me I have to do this, so I have to do this. But it was also something they didn't have to do, is what I'm trying to get at. They could have just left the HUD in. It could have just been a video game feature. But instead, this is a case of video game, gameplay and story integration. You lack a HUD because you're not in the Animus, because you're actually doing this stuff in real life. You're actually applying those skills that we learned across 2 games in the previous games to real life. Very well done. Very definitely. Which builds me to my second point. This really hit home in the stadium section, but overall I had this feeling pretty much throughout the present-day missions, as few of them as they were. It felt like the consequences were more real. In the past sections, it always felt a little, what I call the Grand Theft Auto effect. In other words, there basically is no consequence for failure, other than having to restart the mission. In the present thing, it never felt like that. Even though it's true, there still is no real consequence for failure other than having to restart the mission. They really made the flavor of it and the fleshing out and the immersion of it feel like it was more real. Partially because of the HUD thing, partially because of the way they presented it, partially because it's more real to me because I live in that era. It was modern day. This isn't some past thing that already happened and no matter what I do, it can't change it. This is now, and the stakes are higher. And again, it was very well done, story and gameplay integration. I'm just curious if anybody else had that same feeling with regards to the consequences feeling more concrete in the present. I already made that point, so I don't need to mention that. Abstergo. So, I actually did a whole video during Halloween once about one of the only game series that actually horrified me, and it was this one, the Assassin's Creed series. And it all has to do with the quote-unquote true horror of what Abstergo represents. Now, I like the fact that they're not presented as omnipresent. They aren't like, the police state that runs the world. They're very wealthy, very influential, and they have a great deal of power, but they're not everywhere, and they're not unbeatable. A good balance to made. But this game really helped flesh out a lot of why I felt that way. And I think, the whole revisionist history thing, which has been done before and will be done again, and the whole control through manipulation of media and alteration of facts, that kind of a thing, all of that bothers me. But I think the thing, as I was playing this game, I actually put some thought into trying to explain one of the best ways why the Templars, the Abstergo, the Assassin's Creed series is so terrifying. And I think it's best described by the fact that it's basically only one tiny little step away from the way things actually are. All they changed, the first ones, okay, sure. And then, the magic bloodline, I've already mentioned that. But both of those don't really change the setting, per se. The only things they did to change the setting were the inclusion of the Templars, in other words, that these men of power and influence are organized, and the presence of artifacts, that can manipulate and whatnot. And that's kind of it. The Henry Ford thing is the thing that will always stick in my head forever, and I just wanted to share that here. Very, very, messed. I'm going to mention, I don't even have a note about this, I'm just going to mention something because it was asked. I don't really have much to say about Cross. What I do have to say about Cross is, this game especially feels like it has a bit of the Matrix-y problem where if you didn't read or watch or play or whatever, do the ancillary works, you are probably going to be a little bit more lost as to some of these characters and what's going on. In fact, Haytham himself has a whole thing establishing his character and what happened with him previous to this. I don't remember if it came up before Assassin's Creed 3 or after, but story-wise it's before. Same thing with Cross, Daniel Cross. He's fleshed out a lot more in everything but this. But if you hadn't seen all that or read all that or wasn't aware of it, then all of a sudden just this guy shows up named Daniel Cross, and they mention, he's the assassin, and then he went rogue, and that's basically all you know. So that is both a problem and a benefit. It's one of the things that's wrong with when you start stretching out past your base medium. When you start having little side works and having to consider them continuity. Kind of a good thing, kind of a bad thing, just wanted to comment on it. Hello. What you looking for? Oh, that's actually in my closet. Because I was using it semi-recently.
looking for my other black one.
This is all I have, I'm afraid.
Well, that black one is the same size as that brown one, so you can have it.
Okay, thank you.
Well, you can't have it, but you can use
I can utilize it. Oh, yeah, where was I? I also want to talk about the first ones, the precursors, I don't even know what else to call them, the first civilization. One of the things that we do get in this game is probably the most fleshing out of them as a people that we've ever gotten. It is worth noting that all of that fleshing out is done through the voice of Juno. And as we already know, Juno is, well, we'll talk about her in a minute, but probably not exactly the most reliable narrator, considering we do know for a fact that she has a great deal of hatred of humans, and, you know, that's all I'm going to say about that. But one of the strong impressions I got from this was that the first ones were not evil, per se, even though they did many morally questionable things and generally considered evil, immoral things. I got the really strong impression that the first ones were basically just another society like ours. In fact, I believe that was one of the points that was being made about the whole cycle thing with regards to, you know, the solar flare and the fact that the cycle can repeat, blah, 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 was the fact that the first ones had the exact same problems that humans do when it comes to society. They have good people, they have bad people, and it all just kind of becomes this big grayish mess by the end. I did get the very strong impression that they were very, very desperate by the end in order to salvage their society. But again, would we not be any different if we actually knew that the entire planet Earth was about to be baked and we needed to do something about it? So again, it's hard to actually dislike them. It's a lot easier to dislike Juno in specific. One of the other things I liked, though, that they talked about in this one is they finally... well, okay, a lot of the abilities of both the artifact and the first ones themselves have felt like magic. Again, adding to that fantasy feel I've mentioned before. In this one, they actually go out of their way to talk about how it is not magic, that their prediction of society and their predictions of what's going to happen, which I feel like pointing out so far have been 100% accurate, are just advanced calculations, that they can just actually calculate exactly what's going to happen and when and how and all that fun stuff. I feel like they're trying to make a point with that, but in my opinion that actually detracted a little bit from it. I would have actually preferred it was, you know, actual quote-unquote divination rather than calculations that somehow are perfect for people that couldn't even manage to defend themselves from a single solar incident, even though they could. You get where I'm going with this. It just kind of took me out of the immersion a little bit, and I didn't really care for that, so just thought I'd comment on it. So, one of the things that is really stressed, in this game, I was stressed out, is that the Templars are very fleshed out as people. This is something that actually has not been done since Assassin's Creed 1. Really fleshing out each of the assassination targets as characters rather than just caricatures. And the funny thing is, I feel like it was done better here than it was in 1. I know, go ahead and hate me for it, but I feel it's true. I really actually felt like I knew these characters and that the revelations of what they said on their deathbed scenes were awesome, especially with regards to what had happened throughout the course of their character arc up to that point. I also liked how not all of them were Templars. I'll talk about more what I mean by that in a second, but, you know, Hickey, for example, was just in it for the money. And at the same time, it's not even actually that simple, because his character wasn't that simple. Each one of them was fleshed out to the point where, you know, in Hickey's case, for example, yes, he was out it for the money, but ultimately he was out for the money because it was his belief that dying for a cause rather than dying for something concrete was just foolishness. To actually try to... He was, in other words, he was very pragmatic. He was very realistic. He was like, okay, well, you know, this isn't going to change this and that isn't going to change that, but I will work with these guys because they'll pay me money and I can actually do something with that. Even though it is a risky job and I may die, you know, blah, blah, blah. As opposed to, say, I can't remember his name, John, I want to say. The guy who was trying to get the land, who actually genuinely believed in the cause, who genuinely believed in the fact that if he had claimed all the land of the Native Americans, that he would then, with that claim, be able to keep them safe from what was to come. Now, it would be safe because he would be the one in charge of it, but that is the Templar ideal, after all. And one of the ironies of it, and one of the things Assassin's Creed 3 does, arguably better than any of the other games in the series, is really make the Templars feel like people and not incredibly evil, like they have been portrayed before. I actually talked to my sister about this. The idea here is that when you have a philosophical order that is founded on the concept of controlling everything for their betterment, I'm summarizing, of course, that works if the people in control are all good and stay that way, basically. You get where I'm going with this. That kind of a thing, the prospect of being in charge is naturally going to draw the attention of people and the interest of people in joining that order who are not good, who are just in it for the money, or just in it for themselves, or the power, or the influence, or wanting to be a member of the aristocracy, that kind of a thing. One of the best examples of this, I think, is the Borgia, which I believe I'm pronouncing wrong because I'm terrible. Whatever. The gentleman who became the Pope in Assassin's Creed 2 and in Brotherhood, I believe was the other game he was in. He was someone who I get the very strong impression was basically not a Templar. There were a few characters elsewise. There was one in Revelations like this too. But basically they were just joining the Templar Order because it was a route to power. It was a society they could join in order to advance their own interests. One of my favorite scenes in this game is when Haytham, who is a true Templar, was beating a man to a bloody pulp. This would be Church in this case, I remember him. Who was literally just using the Templar Order for his own gain. I think that really it explains my point in a nutshell there. There is a very wide divide between the Templar as an ideal and the Templars as people. And Church himself is, of course, a great example of this. Someone who, even as he was fleshed out as someone who was basically a pessimist who believed that no matter what you do, life is going to suck, and therefore the only thing you can do is to make things better for yourself. And admittedly, it's kind of hard to argue with that given what happens in the game, but the point remains. Let's go ahead and talk about two of the Templars in specific. The first Templar I want to talk about is actually... we'll talk about Haytham first. There's no other way to put this. I really liked Haytham in this game. He is, without question, my favorite character in the game. He is debatably my favorite character in the series so far. He's at the very least in consideration for the top 3. They really did a good job with him. The voice acting, the writing, the presentation, even the animation. He was an incredibly well done character. Very, very much props to how they fleshed him out. And the thing is, he was very much a character too. I cannot summarize him per se. I mean, no, yes, he was a true believer in the Templar ideal, but that's just one bullet point. That doesn't explain the whole extent of the character. I also really, really liked. Where is it? I had a point here. Excuse me. I really liked the way he was being portrayed as someone who genuinely cared about the people, and yet did so in a very pragmatic and almost amoral way. In other words, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, if you'll forgive me for just pulling the quote out. He had no problem killing people, hurting people, bribing people, doing terrible, terrible things, but the entire time he was actually doing that for the betterment of the people as a whole, for society as a whole. Now, there's a flaw in that, and that flaw is the fact that a society is just made of people. And when you start looking at something like that, all you're going to see is a blob. You're not actually going to see the nuances, the subtleties, the points, the specific individuals that actually matter in that society. But even with that pragmatic viewpoint, I'm sorry, I'm just going to kind of skip ahead here. Haytham's final scene, where he talks to Connor, really, really got across the point and summarized his character better than I ever could, where he talks about, I'm not going to apologize for what I did because he genuinely believed in what he did. I'm not going to, do anything like that because I was right. He believes he was right, even as he's dying. And yet he is actually proud of his son and what his son has accomplished, because his son is, in many ways, the ideal he strives for, just lacking the hardened edge, for lack of a better way to put it, the pessimism, the pragmatism that Haytham had. But his final line really strikes me. I should have killed you... forgive me for paraphrasing, this is not an exact quote. I should have killed you when you were a child. Now that sounds horrible, But what he is saying there is that he, in his final moments, is realizing that he too is human. He didn't because he loved his son. He cared about his son. He had no idea how to show it, no idea how to express it. He tries. When all the missions you're going through him, he is actually trying to show you how much you mean to him. And he is trying to enlighten you, basically, to turn you over to his side of his way of thinking. And he really is, too. But he's not doing it because Connor's an asset. He's not doing it because Connor is someone that could be utilized for the cause. He's doing it because he cares about him. And in his final moments, he fully admits that what he believes to be a flaw in himself, and in so doing admits to the truth of exactly what this entire game is basically about. That we are all human. Good, bad, in between, and often just kind of bouncing around the board. We all make mistakes, we all do good things, we all do bad things. In fact, if I could go ahead here, Haytham makes some really good points. I want to go ahead and I wrote down a couple of specific quotes here. He was talking to Connor about the George Washington thing, and how George Washington was, Connor says the people elected George Washington to be the supreme commander. And Haytham correctly points out, no, the rich and privileged chose the individual who would most benefit them. And one of the other things, this is one of the points which the game is not subtle about, it's just right in your face. Throughout the whole game it's emphasized over and over and over, these people are talking about freedom, peace, and ideals, and we must be free from Britain. Don't mistake me. I agree with the American Revolution. I actually do. I think it was the correct move for the time. I think we needed to sever from Britain. But what cannot be denied is these people who are doing so were constantly talking about freedom and independence and peace while slavery was still very alive and well. And while discrimination was still very alive and well, and while they were just actively taking away land from people, constantly. And I'm not even talking about the obvious examples. This stuff was just happening to even white males who weren't rich, who weren't landowners, who weren't privileged. The system was built around the same aristocracy that had been a problem back in Europe, and would still be a problem, basically right up until World War I really hit. And the game is absolutely blunt and brutal about constantly smashing you in the face with this fact. Now, anybody who's studied history knows this. This is not exactly new. But the game tries to put a personal spin on it, tries to show you individuals, individual people, individual places who are injured or hurt or worsened by this process, by this thing, rather than just vague names or facts or, historical concepts. I also want to comment on a quote here. We're building to something, I swear. One of Church's final words is, this is a little bit of a paraphrase because I didn't write it down quickly enough. There is no single path that is right and just and does no harm. I mentioned he was a pessimist. I mentioned that, he was excusing his actions because of his belief system. But that point really is interesting because, again, we are all people. It's not even necessarily a bad thing. Our individuality, our differences make it so that it's very difficult to choose a particular path in life that isn't going to hurt anyone at any point in time in any way. Because we're all just different, and we all have different needs and wants and desires, and etc., etc., etc. And when you get to the national level, I'm going to skip ahead just a bit here in my notes. I have a note here called Altair versus Ezio versus Connor. I'm only going to talk about this briefly. Altair and Ezio had a very different flavor and feel to them. Props to them on this. Altair always felt like the wizened leader, the scribe, the sage, the man who was learned and would teach his people and lead them to glory. But I don't mean lead in the strictest sense of the word, because that was Ezio. Ezio always felt like the leader. He was the one who was actually in charge. He was the general. He was the emperor. Whatever title you want to attach to him doesn't matter. He was the man who actually was charismatic and, front lines, very much, the warrior-born kind of an individual. Which brings us to Connor. Now, I've already talked negative about Connor, but I do have to give them credence to this one point. Connor did very much feel like a child. Altair was a great leader of men due to his skill, his experience, his wizened nature, his wisdom. Ezio was a great leader of men because he was very charismatic, very strong, very intelligent, very fierce fighter, very driven. Connor was not a great leader of men because he was a child. The point here is, even though all those things that I mentioned before are genuine negatives, from a storytelling perspective, I think it was important to show exactly what happens when a child gets involved on these events, on things that change and shape nations and history. Someone who should not, for all intents and purposes, be here. Someone who should not, for all intents and purposes, be doing this kind of things on this scale, with this type of thing, with this kind of responsibility, but had it thrust upon him because he was just a pawn in someone else's game. And I do have to credit the game that, because by the end, it was hard not to feel bad for Connor. And you know what? We'll just go ahead and get right into it. I haven't talked about Charles Lee yet, even though he's technically the last boss. Charles Lee is a fascinating character because if you're not paying attention, he looks like a caricature. But if you are paying attention, he is also, just like many other characters in this game, very, very human. He, even in the earlier sections when he was the assistant, someone who hadn't even joined the order yet, he was very brash, very prone to more violent actions than Haytham was, more prone to just beating in the door, literally, in other ways as well. So when he comes about and actually starts his, so-called evil moment, when he is met by Connor in the present, when he's a child, it didn't really feel like a stretch to me. And then he threatens Connor, but even that didn't feel like, this was much, much later. Towards the end of the game, Connor approaches him and he just threatens the hell out of Connor. That didn't feel out of character too, especially given the next thing he did was run and flee, which still didn't feel out of character. I'm going to talk about this now, and then I'm going to segue finally into my big point, which I have like 20 notes about. The final scene where you approach the bar, the tavern, where Lee is sitting there, still injured after your incident with him, after the big climactic chase. You have this big climactic chase, you're running through a burning ship, and you get down there, and you're injured, and he's injured, and you barely walk away. Very, very appropriate, for all intents and purposes, that was the final stage, Ended on a very high note, but then it just plummets. Because in the very last scene, Connor just walks up, puts the knife down, sits next to Lee, and there's no dialogue. This is actually the only scene that actually made me cry. Well, I guess that's a lie, there's two that made me cry, but Lee doesn't say anything, Connor doesn't say anything, they're both bloody, they're both injured, they're both just sitting there. Lee picks up his drink, takes a drink, hands it to Connor. Connor takes a drink, and then Connor kills him. The significance of that scene cannot be understated, because that was two men who, through coincidence, were on opposite sides and had both lost everything as a result of this conflict. Connor, at the end there, only cared about taking down Lee because he knew he had nothing left. He had failed to protect his people. He had failed to protect his home. He had failed to protect his friends. He had failed to stop the Templars. He had nothing left except this last bit of... It wasn't even revenge at that point. It was just this last action that he could take. And Lee? He'd lost all his power, all his friends, everything he believed in, all his efforts had amounted to nothing. Both of these men lost everything because they were both victims of two sides fighting each other. The very concept of two sides fighting each other took away everything they ever loved or cared about. And that is probably the strongest way I could segue into the theme of Assassin's Creed 3 in a nutshell. Assassin's Creed 3 is about gray versus gray. It is about the difference, or rather the lack of difference between two sides when those two sides are in conflict with each other, whether it's economic conflict, military conflict, political conflict, philosophical conflict, physical conflict, doesn't matter. we see this constantly, over and over and over throughout the game. The entire thing about the Loyalists versus the Patriots. The entire thing about the British versus the French. The entire thing about Connor versus Haytham. The entire thing about Lee versus Connor. The thing between Juno and Minerva. Every single one of these is just another example of this exact same concept. The fact that there's this eternal pattern to two sides fighting, even though when it really boils down to it, they kind of shouldn't be. One of my favorite sections is when William, in the present, is talking to Desmond, and Desmond actually asks flat out, have we ever thought about peace with the Templars? And William actually lays it out. He's pretty honest about it. He's like, yeah, we've even managed peace a few times with the Templars. But the problem is, our differences are fundamental. We believe in peace through freedom. They believe in peace through control. And so, and then he has this wonderful thing where he says, even when we're together, we would spend all our time being worried about the other trying to backstab us, so we're more productive when we're at war. And while that may be pessimistically and pragmatically true, what we see in many individuals, and again, most powerfully in Connor and Lee, is exactly what happens as a result of that war. What happens on the individual level. Because that's really where it comes in. It's all well and good to wave a flag and to be on a side, but we see throughout Assassin's Creed individual people whose lives are destroyed by conflict. By conflict between two sides, two banners, two hidden people. I mean, how many people even know the Templars and Assassins existed in colonial America? How many know about that in everyday life? I mean, for God's sakes. It's actually funny because I just finished the Witcher series where one of the big themes was civilization and the ills that come with that. One of the ills that comes with civilization is the very concept that conflict is natural. It is. When you have a civilization, when you have a society, people will group up with people they either think are or agree to be like-minded. They may not actually be like-minded. Some of them are. But, they'll group up here and they'll group up here, and these people will disagree. I feel like I'm hammering this point in, so forgive me. I'm going to go ahead and move on. I could just keep talking about it. I could just keep talking about this, but there's two really wonderful hammer points, other than the big one, the Charles and Lee one. Or, excuse me, the Connor and Lee one. I'll talk about the smaller one first. That's Juno and Minerva. What we see in Juno and Minerva is the very concept of Templar and Assassin taken to its furthest extent. I believe that we are looking at the absolute extreme end of both. Minerva refused to let Juno free. She refused to allow that order, that Templar ideal, to win. And she refused it to such an extreme that she let her own civilization burn. And the earth was baked because of Minerva's decision. That is pretty much the most extreme aspect of the assassin's philosophy. But then we have Juno, who thinks that she should be in charge of everything. That she should bring back the First Society for all intents and purposes and command and control everything. Absolutely. Which again is the furthest extent of the Templar philosophy. And I think it's interesting that in the two of them, once again we see the price of what happens when two sides fight. Now, obviously Desmond Miles dying, spoiler alert, that's the other big spoiler. I haven't said the big spoiler yet, have I? I guess I'll say that last. Desmond Miles dying, ironically, I don't consider that the big spoiler. I know, weird, right? Was certainly a powerful moment, but honestly, I felt it was more powerful for William than Desmond. Now, granted, I liked William more, and he was better voiced and had more fleshing out of his character. But that being said, I really feel that Desmond was someone who was a nobody. He was just some guy, and then he got dragged into this, and now he has to sacrifice his life. Okay. William was an ordinary man, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, trying to do the best he can, and had finally reached the point where he had started to reconcile with his son, started to express to his son what he had failed at doing for years. The same thing Haytham did. And yes, there are some very strong similarities between William Miles and Haytham. Very strong. And it's also worth noting there's some pretty strong similarities between Connor and Desmond while we're at it. And I cannot imagine that those were incidental. But while Connor had to kill his father because of, the whole thing, the whole thematic problem, William had to lose his son because of that thematic problem. And when he had finally started to actually reach out and be reached out back and to just be his father rather than be the figurehead, rather than be the leader, when he could finally be a dad, and now he's lost all that because of the Templars versus the Assassins, because of the ideological differences, because of side versus side. I feel bad for William. I feel really bad for him. The forgive me, let's go ahead and talk about, I'm going to just wind this down here. A few notes right at the end here. For example, the significance of what Connor does right before he goes after Lee is basically, I kind of already mentioned this, but he puts on the war paint, he cuts his hair, he puts himself down. He is basically saying at that point, in his own way, that he is no longer an assassin, that he is no longer part of the side versus side thing. He is no longer part of the loyalist versus the patriots. He is no longer taking part in all this crap, because by that point in time he has come to realize just how much is wrong with the side versus side problem. And he himself as an individual is going to go after Charles Lee as an individual, not because he's a Templar, but because he is Lee, and he is going to kill him. Like I mentioned earlier, the single-minded determination. And the significance of when he finally removes the hatchet at the end was just... that I was really hoping they'd have that scene in there, because that kind of signifies it right there. He removed the hatchet. Buried the hatchet. That phrase exists for a reason, And the epilogue. The epilogue just hammers you in the face. Really badly. I'm not even talking about all of it, but suffice it to say, all the land being given away in order to settle debts, in order to try and pay for the new country that had to happen. It's one of those horrible things where it's bad, but you can understand why it is. You can't even call the people who are doing it evil, because they're just doing what they have to in order to exist in a civilization. It's one of the costs of that we've talked about before. Very last thing I'm going to talk about. Double checking my notes really quick before I get to this, because I do want to make this my last thing here. Talked about that. I've got notes everywhere. I had a lot of notes to talk about in this game. As I was playing as Haytham, I hadn't actually read his secondary story yet. I actually paused to do so in the game at that point. The whole time, I have to admit, that was the really big reveal for me. I'm mentioning this last not just because it was an awesome scene, but because this really hammers the point in better than anything else, I think. As we're playing as Haytham, he obviously is an assassin. He obviously has the bloodline, the superhuman abilities. I already talked about that. But as you're playing as him, everything he's doing, and he's doing as he's recruiting people, and as he's being sent by the Order to America, to the Americas and all that, and as he's been chased by some other side, it's really, really obvious the whole time that he's with the assassins. Even in hindsight, even replaying through that section, I have to say I would still say they are portraying him as an assassin, as a member of the Brotherhood. But that's actually my exact point. When their actions and the things that they're doing and everything they're trying to accomplish basically comes across the exact same as the opposite side, you get where I'm going with this. You get it kind of highlights the fallacy of the whole side versus side thing in a nutshell. When both sides are basically trying for the same thing, they're just using slightly different methods. However, I have to give them credits because they completely pulled the rug out from under me. When there was the big scene and they finally induct Charles Lee into their order, and this whole time I'm like, okay, so he'll be part of the Brotherhood and all that, and then they say, join the Templars. And I was, what? That honestly, genuinely caught me. Feel free to share if you think I'm stupid and I should have just caught on to that earlier. But no, even in repeat viewings, that still catches me. I mean, obviously, I know it's coming, but my point is, I still don't see it coming. I still, even reanalyzing it still doesn't seem particularly well it's not something that I could have guessed. And I want to stress this because not only does that really get across the thematic point of the fallacy of side versus side, but it also is really, really rare that a story will actually surprise me. That's not arrogance, by the way. I'm not trying to brag. It's just true. It's very rare for that to happen, partially because of spoilers. And I think that's my final point about the game, is the fact that, while it is very heavily romanticized, especially compared to, say, The Witcher or The Witcher 2, one of the things the Assassin's Creed series has always been really good about is its presentation. It has an essence to it, a flavor to it, that really fleshes it out, makes its characters feel more human, makes it feel more real, makes it feel emotive, impactful. Even if it's not particularly well written, even if there's still flaws in it, even if there are many, many problems with it, even though I'll probably never actually play this game again, I still really enjoyed the experience, and it actually got to me. It actually made me feel. And I think that's probably the best note I could end this one on. So I will hopefully talk to you guys at the next Rumination. Have a good one.